Good morning. You're all wondering why we called you here today. And it's because it's raining and we need something to do inside. It's wonderful to see so many people come for our latest history talk, where the Historical Commission of Westtown is delighted to present this free to the community. And it's so nice to see a good response. The talks have been great. We are posting them on YouTube in case anybody wants to follow up and get some extra details. So I'd like to introduce our speaker, who is a celebrated member of the Historical Commission and somebody who is deeply involved in Civil War history in particular, and that's Dave Waters.
Okay, good morning. Our topic this morning is Chester County's Civil War generals. These are men who marched where duty called, and of the 10 men, 2 were killed in action. 1 died 50 years later from wounds he received during the war. Several of the others were wounded. So these were generals who led from the front, not from back in some bunker 2 miles behind the lines. No. Here we go. This was working. What's the problem? There it is. Okay. There's the 10 men with some connection to Chester County. They weren't all born here. They didn't all die here, but as we go through, you'll see a connection. First, let's talk about what a general is. This is a complicated issue. First of all, you had brevet generals, which brevet means you were promoted on the field temporarily, and later you would be commissioned by the U.S. Senate, your commission signed by Abraham Lincoln. So you had brevet generals, and then you had commission generals. You also had several ranks of generals. You had brigadier general, major general, lieutenant general. In the Union Army, if you commanded a brigade, which would be 4 or 5 regiments, you usually started out as a colonel. And after a while, if you handled your brigade nicely, you would get promoted to brigadier general. If you commanded a division, which was a number of brigades, you would usually get promoted to major general. And if you commanded a corps or an army, you were still a major general in the Union Army. In the Confederate Army, once you commanded a brigade, you were a brigadier general. You commanded a division, you became a major general. And if you commanded an Army Corps or higher, you were a lieutenant general. So in the Union Army, or in the Confederate Army, you had about 17 lieutenant generals. And in the Union Army, you had 1 lieutenant general, who was Ulysses S. Grant towards the end of the war. Then you also had another distinction between the volunteer army and the regular army. So if you were a West Pointer, you had a commission in the regular army. And if you were one of the volunteers, you had a commission in the volunteer army. And the rank you wanted was in the regular army, because that set you up for a pension and all sorts of other benefits. The ranks were vastly different. And as an example, let's take General Custer. Custer was a major general of volunteers, but his rank at the end of the war was only captain in the regular army. So there was a big disparity, and you'll see with one of these guys how he responded to that. So let's take a look at our generals here. First was Colonel George Washington Roberts of the 42nd Illinois. He was born in East Goshen, Pennsylvania. He grew up here and he went to Yale in 1857 and he practiced law in Westchester, but he moved to Chicago 2 years before the war started. And when the war broke out, he enlisted in the 42nd Illinois. He became colonel and he was killed at Stones River, December 1862, while acting as a brigade commander in Sheridan's division. So he's one of those that was breveted brigadier general after he was killed posthumously. His body was brought back here to Chester County and he was buried at Oakland Cemetery. And there's his tombstone. It says, he fell in the War of the Rebellion at the Battle of Stone River near Murfreesboro, Tennessee, while acting brigadier general in Sheridan's 3rd Brigade. He was a man of noble aims, high aspirations, and possessed a most kind and generous heart. There's a depiction of the battle at Stones River where his Illinois brigade charged the rebels on the first day and at the Harding House, and he was killed. But the charge and Sheridan's generalship of the 3rd Division saved the Union lines that day, and they won the Battle of Stones River. It's interesting. He led the charge. He was not, as I said, back hiding, or not hiding, directing from the rear. Here's our next general, Brigadier General Israel Vadges. He was born in Willistown, 1816. He was educated here locally. He was in the West Point class of 1837, and his classmates included Jubal Early, a Confederate general, Hooker, a Union general, Pemberton, a Philadelphian who was a Confederate general and surrendered Vicksburg, John Sedgwick, and Braxton Bragg, another Confederate general. He was a pretty good mathematician, so he was appointed professor of mathematics at West Point. And one of his star students was Ulysses S. Grant. We don't think of Grant much in terms of mathematics, but it must have been one of his favorite topics. When the war broke out, he was a captain at Fort Monroe down in Virginia. And he was assigned to Fort Pickens in Florida, where he was captured by the rebels. After he was exchanged early in the war, there was a lot of pretty rapid exchanges. He was appointed Brigadier General of Volunteers and posted to the 10th Corps. And he then had brigade and division commands in South Carolina. Part of his command included what was called the African Brigade, a brigade of U.S. colored troops. When the war ended, he was in command of the Union defenses at Norfolk and Portsmouth, Virginia, and he stayed in the Army, and he retired in 1881 to New York City. Here's two of his commands. There's Fort Pickens, Florida, which he defended, but then the Rebs captured it. And there's a depiction of the African Brigade and the 55th Massachusetts as they entered into Charleston. So he was in command of the African Brigade. There's his grave marker. He's buried at West Point. It says on there, Brevet Brigadier General, USA. Well, let's move on to our third general, Brigadier General Mott Houghton. He was born in Philadelphia in 1838. but he moved with his widowed mother to West Goshen farm of his grandfather in 1848. As best I can determine, that farm was off of Paoli Pike over near where the East High School is. He entered into service June 4th, 1861, as a sergeant in the Brandywine Guards, which was Company A of the First Pennsylvania Reserves. The First Pennsylvania Reserves was Pennsylvania's private army. Remember, Lincoln called for 75,000 volunteers. Pennsylvania filled its quota almost immediately, and there were literally thousands of others who wanted to serve that they didn't have a position for. So Governor Curtin created the First Pennsylvania Reserves. And throughout the war, that was technically under Governor Curtin's command, a reserve Pennsylvania Army in effect. But they had as you'll see, a great deal of service in the Union Army. So they trained at Camp Wayne. Camp Wayne is basically where the campus of Westchester University is today. Camp Wayne existed for about half a year. It trained a number of regiments there. He was promoted to captain of Company A in October of '61. Here's a man who was wounded twice, at Second Bull Run and again at the Wilderness. And he wasn't promoted to major until March 15th, 1865. Towards the end of the war in March and April of 1865, the Union Army started promoting, they were just giving out like candy at Halloween or something, the promotions. So he did not make general during the Civil War, but he's a very interesting character. There's a picture of him, Captain Hooton with his Company A. And when they were in camp, the regiments used to, or the companies used to make those arches that show where the street for their tents began. So there he is in front of Company A, the Brandywine Guards. You can see they put his name up there above the A. And speaking of the First Pennsylvania Reserves, there's their monument at Gettysburg. They were part of the 5th Corps, General Crawford's division. And if you look down that list of battles, they weren't at First Bull Run, but look at that. They were at virtually every major battle in the East. After Cold Harbor, their terms were up and many of them re-enlisted, but you can see there they were instrumental in fighting in many of the campaigns of the Army of the Potomac. After the Civil War, he found he loved the Army, so he joined the U.S. Regular Army as a first lieutenant. Remember, he was a major at the end of the Civil War in the volunteers, but when he joins the regular army, he's a first lieutenant, which is what, the second rank up. He served most of his next 30 years on the frontier, Texas, Colorado, Montana. He was leading Company K of the 22nd U.S. Infantry in the campaign to punish the Sioux after they massacred Custer on June 25th, 1876. And he was cited for gallantry in defending a supply train against the Sioux in 1876 at Spring Creek, Montana. Has anybody ever heard of this skirmish? I never did. He was breveted major in 1890, a lieutenant colonel in 98. He was in Cuba for the Spanish-American War. He became a colonel of the 28th, and he served in the Philippines after we seized that from the Spanish. He was finally promoted to brigadier general in April 1902, and he retired the next day, which is still typical today, I understand, where you get promoted one day and you retire the next day because it affects your pension. And after retirement, he traveled extensively. He said, we don't know anything about this battle at Spring Creek, but the famous Western artist, Frederick Remington, did a painting of the 22nd Infantry holding off the Sioux. Remington's paintings sell for hundreds of thousands of dollars. And for him to have covered this little skirmish is interesting. It must have meant a lot more at the time than it came down to us in the history books. There's his grave. He was also brought back to Chester County, buried at Oakland Cemetery. He had died up in Maine. I'm sure you guys who helped clean up these cemeteries may have stumbled over his grave any number of times. So he's a Chester County who made general after the Civil War, but was certainly involved in the Civil War, and it helped make his career. Then we come to General Benjamin Franklin Fisher. He was born in Center County, Pennsylvania, near where Penn State is today, but he was raised in Sellersville. He was captain of the 32nd Pennsylvania, and he was detailed to the Signal Corps. And that meant in the Peninsular Campaign, he had duty with Lowe's balloon operations. In September of '62, he actually became the chief signal officer of the Army of the Potomac. Shortly thereafter, or a year later, he was captured by the Gray Ghost, John Singleton Mosby, near Aldie, Virginia, while scouting Lee's movements north that eventually ended up at the Battle of Gettysburg. He was sent to Libby Prison, where he and 108 other prisoners escaped through a tunnel. It was the largest and most successful escape from Libby Prison during the whole war. And he made his way through the Chickahominy swamps to Union lines near Williamsburg, Virginia. And thereafter, he served in Grant's Overland Campaign in 1864-5, and he ended the war at St. Petersburg. And you can see there, he was breveted Brigadier General in March of 1865, along with seemingly thousands of other people. After the war, he was a financier and he practiced law in Philadelphia. Around 1900, he consolidated parcels of land at Valley Forge Mountain, which is in Chester County, and it included Cold Springs, which was near where Washington's headquarters is today. And from that spring, he sold spring water and he operated a farm. And he died at his home on Valley Forge Mountain, Chester County, September 5th, 1915. There's a picture of the observation balloons that they used early in the war. And officers would go up in the balloon and they could spot from 1,000 feet what the Rebs were doing. By the Gettysburg campaign, it was so unwieldy and everything that they stopped using him. But Fisher was the chief signal officer for the Army of the Potomac. There's a picture of the notorious Libby Prison and for Union officers in Richmond, an old tobacco warehouse. And for 109 men to tunnel out of that and get back to Union lines is quite a feat. But he was involved in that. There's his Colonial Springs Bottling Company on Valley Forge Mountain. He owned it, then he leased it. And upon his death, it was sold to Charles Hires of Hires root beer fame. So there's a picture in 1915 when about when he died. And those ruins are still there today on Valley Forge Mountain. There's General Fisher's grave with a GAR marker and flag at Morris Cemetery in Phoenixville, Chester County. That's me there. I visited his grave and found that there was no marker and there was no flag, so I put one there. Last time I went by, it had been run over by a lawnmower, and I had to fix General Franklin's grave again. Our next general is General George Archibald McCall. He was born in Philadelphia in 1802, so he's a relatively older gentleman, and he lived until only until 1867. He was in a class at West Point 1822 with Confederate General Isaac Trimble and Union General David Hunter. He was old enough to have fought in the Second Seminole War, and he was a brevet lieutenant colonel in the Mexican War, and he retired as a colonel in 1853. So 8 years go by, and we talked about Curtin and the famous Pennsylvania reserves. Curtin's first choice was a man you might have heard of, George Brinton McClellan. And McClellan was on his way to Harrisburg to accept the generalship of the Pennsylvania reserves when he stopped in Ohio, and the governor of Ohio persuaded him to be the commander of all the Ohio forces. So McClellan went on to other fame, as you know, and Curtin turned to his second choice, General George Archibald McCall. So he led them in the Peninsula Campaign in 1862. Another general who was wounded at Glendale, and he was captured and sent to Libby Prison. He did not escape, but he was exchanged 2 months later for General Simon Buckner, who had surrendered Fort Donaldson to U.S. Grant. So they exchanged general for general. He was ill and war weary. He was recovering from his wound and everything. So he resigns in March of 1863, and he retires to his farm in Westchester. And after the war, GAR, Grand Army of the Republic, Post 31 in Westchester, took his name, and Philadelphia has named a public school after him. Now here's a map of the Battle of Glendale. His reserves were in the Union 5th Corps, and they helped blunt an attack by Longstreet's division. And rallying his men, McCall was captured by the 47th Virginia. You can see right here, here's McCall's brigade attacking towards Longstreet and then getting pushed. But in this battle delayed the Confederates long enough that McClellan was able to extract the army down to Malvern Hill and avoid having the army cut in half and disaster. So McCall's division was very instrumental in stopping the Rebs in this occasion. There's the flag of the McCall Post 31 GAR. It was chartered in 1867 and met in various rooms about the borough. In 1909, it obtained Horticultural Hall and renamed it the Memorial Hall. That's part of the Chester County History Center now. The high renovation caused 150 members to leave. And they set up a General Gus post, but they were denied the GAR charter and they only lasted 10 years. There's a picture of General McCall Post 31. in front of Memorial Hall in Westchester sometime after 1909. And their membership is dwindled considerably in that picture. Every one of them looks like they're ancient. Now, McCall's farm is called Bel Air, and it was northeast of Westchester. And here's the 1873 Whitmer map of East and West Goshen. And you can see McCall Station here on the Westchester Railroad that went out to Fraser. Looking at this crowd, probably every one of you has been to the Fern Hill Medical Campus at one time or another. It's the entrance to the McCall property is right across the street from the Fern Hill Medical Campus, and you can still see the gates that led back to his estate. So look for that the next time you're there for an appointment. There's the elementary school. It's 7th Street in Philadelphia. It's a Blue Ribbon award-winning school which serves Chinatown and the surrounding areas. And there's his grave marker. He's buried at Christ Church Burial Ground in Philadelphia. On there it says he's Colonel and Inspector General USA, Brigadier General, Commanding Volunteers. Our next general, General Zook. Sounds like a good Amish name. He was born in Tredyffrin. He lived in Port Kennedy, which is right there at the entrance to Valley Forge. His father had been a major in the American Revolution, and he studied at Strode's Academy in East Bradford. I'm not exactly sure where that was, probably somewhere around Strode's Mill there. Across the street from okay, that's where he studied. When the war broke out in 1861, he was in New York City and he was president of the Washington and New York Telegraph Company. He organized the 57th New York Volunteers. He's known to be a fearless man and a stern disciplinarian. He was ill and he missed Second Bull Run in Antietam, but he was wounded at Fredericksburg before Marie's Heights while leading Hancock's attack, the unsuccessful attack, the slaughter at the Battle of Fredericksburg. And he was promoted to Brigadier General in March of 1863. Here's a map of part of the second day at Gettysburg, and you can see here Zook's brigade at the attack at the wheat field. Those of you who know Civil War history, General Sickle took his 3rd Corps out of the line without telling General Meade and moved them up to the Emmitsburg Road. And when the Confederates attacked, when Longstreet's Corps attacked, they were pushed back, and Meade had to send elements of Hancock's 2nd Corps out to slow them down and stop them. So Zook was part of that element of the 2nd Corps that was sent out to stop the Rebs at the wheat field. So as I said, when Sickles' 3rd Corps collapsed, Hancock sent out reinforcements, and Zook took up the colors of the 53rd New York, and he led the attack against the Rebs to the south of where his position was. His brigade was taken in flank by Confederate troops under General Kershaw, who advanced from the Peach Orchard, which is up the road here. So Zook is moving this way, and the Rebs are all around, and he's taken in the flank. And a lot of officers during the Civil War stayed on their horses. And that made you a pretty good target. the Rebs knew who to shoot the officers. So he was shot through the body several times, and he died the next day, but not until learning that the Union had been victorious. Posthumously, he was breveted Major General. So that's the monument along Wheatfield Road where they believe Zook was shot. So they take his body back to New York, and one of his pallbearers is future President Chester A. Arthur, who was at the time Quartermaster General for New York State Troops, and he was a close friend of General Zook. So he served as a pallbearer when Zook lay in state in New York City. There's Zook's grave marker. He's at Montgomery Cemetery in Norristown, and nearby is the grave of his Corps commander, General Winfield Scott Hancock. What a coincidence. Hancock was defeated in the 1880 presidential race by the ticket of Garfield and Zook's friend, Chester Arthur. Now we come to General John Rutter Brooke. He was born in Pottstown, but he was a relative of the Coates of Coatesville. He was educated at Bolmar Academy in Westchester. Bolmar Academy used to be up towards where Chester County Hospital is now. He went to Ursinus College. He married Louisa Roberts Warwick of Chester County in 1863. He was colonel of the 53rd Pennsylvania, and then he was made brigade commander, fought at Antietam and Gettysburg, where he too was wounded. Very few of our generals didn't get a wound, it appears. He was breveted brigadier general for service in Grant's Overland campaign and was wounded at Cold Harbor. After the war, he came back to Chester County. He managed briefly the Thorndale Iron Works, and he was briefly chairman of the Chester County Republican Party. He returned to the military in 1866, and he was in command of the forces at Wounded Knee, famous massacre of the Indians. He was made a major general in 1897. After the Spanish-American War, he was the military governor of Puerto Rico and Cuba. He retired in 1902 and lived in Philadelphia. Here's the situation at Antietam, September 17th, 1863, which is the bloodiest single day in American history. He commanded the 3rd Division in Richardson's division of Sumner's Corps. And when French's division stalled in front of the resistance by the Rebs in the sunken road, Sumner sent Richardson's division with Brooke to push through. And Brooke and Richardson's other brigades broke the rebel line here at the sunken road, but could advance no further. There's a picture of the Confederate dead in the sunken road or Bloody Lane at the Battle of Antietam. So this was the bloody result of General Brooke's charge at the sunken road. As I said, he was in charge of the 7th Cavalry under General Forsyth, who reported to General Brooke. This was the 7th Cavalry's revenge for the Custer's last stand. They massacred more than 200 Lakota Sioux men, women, and children. It's still a pretty shameful day in American history. What's even more shameful is there were 20 medals of honor were awarded to the cavalrymen involved in this massacre. In later years, Congress has taken away a lot of medals of honor that were won for the Indian campaigns, but they've never taken away these 20 medals of honor for this massacre. And one of the medals of honor, believe it or not, today to win a medal of honor, you're usually killed in action and you've saved fellow soldiers and done something heroic. One of these medals of honor was awarded to a guy, a soldier, who went after a supply mule that had run away. He caught the mule, brought it back, and won the Medal of Honor. So this is not a high point in U.S. military history. But General Brooks served as a national commander for 2 years of the Military Order of the Loyal Legion of the United States. And that's an organization of Union Army officers, and it's still active today with descendants of these officers. There's his grave marker. He's buried in Arlington National Cemetery. He died in 1926. There was only one Union Civil War general still alive at the time, and his name was Adelbert Ames. I just noticed yesterday as I reviewed this that that's not the wife, the same wife that he married in 1863. So he must have had a second marriage. Who's next? General John Grubb Park. He was born in Coatesville, and he's a descendant of the Parks family that founded Parksburg. After his birth, they moved to Westchester, to a house at High and Minor Street. But when he was age 8, they moved into Philadelphia. And he graduated from West Point, number 2 in his class, and he was appointed to the Corps of Engineers, which is where all the top graduates in the class were assigned. He was in charge of the survey that established the final boundary between the United States and British North America, or Canada. As a West Point grad, he was appointed Brigadier General of Volunteers at the start of the Civil War, and a year later promoted to Major General. He was Chief of Staff to General Ambrose Burnside's 9th Corps. But during the Vicksburg campaign, when the 9th Corps was sent west, he was in command and also during the siege at Petersburg. He was the second in seniority to General Meade, who was commander of the Army of the Potomac. So whenever Meade was absent from the field at Petersburg, Rochester County native was in charge of the Army of the Potomac. He was in charge that day when Robert E. Lee made his last offensive move of the Civil War, when he assaulted the Union position at Fort Stedman, and General Park organized the counterattack that led to about 4,000 of Lee's men being captured. After the war, he stayed in the Army. He became superintendent of West Point, retired in 1889. He married, he had a daughter. He died in Washington, December 1900. He was the last commander of the Army of the Potomac to die. Here's the map there of the 49th parallel that Park headed the topographical engineers that surveyed that boundary in 1849. And I believe it's still the same boundary we have today, but he was in charge of that. There's Fort Stedman. It was the last gasp of Lee to break the Union siege. He had General John Gordon attack Fort Stedman March 25th, with 10,000 men. They said Park organized a counterattack. They suffered 4,000 casualties, and Lee's army was so weakened that Grant's attack on April 2nd punched through the Confederate defenses. And 7 days later, we know that Lee surrendered at Appomattox. As I said, he was superintendent for several years at the U.S. Military Academy. And there's his grave marker at the St. James the Less Episcopal Churchyard in Philadelphia. Now, our last couple of generals are really local guys. This is General Henry Gus. He was born in Chester Springs, but his father soon moved to Westchester to pursue real estate development. Westchester was a booming town. He commanded the National Guard's militia company in Westchester in the 1850s. There were 185 members, of whom 40 were active. And militia units in the 1850s usually consisted of the firemen of the town, the other young bucks. They'd get together on Sunday, they'd drill on Market Street or High Street, impress the girls with their uniforms, and then go get drunk. That's basically what militia units did in the 1850s. But anyway, when the war breaks out, he's given a colonel's commission, and he raises the 97th Pennsylvania, which is basically Chester County's 3-year regiment. At least 2/3 of the men were Chester Countyans. They trained at Camp Wayne before moving off to the war in October. He was first given brigade command in April '63 as part of General Hunter's operations against the city of Charleston. In 1864, due to some sort of political dispute, I haven't been able to nail down, but he ended up resigning from the service and comes back to Westchester. However, he is advanced to Brevet Major General of Volunteers again in March of 1865. Now, the 97th Pennsylvania was sent off to Florida, and basically they sat out the first year of the war, most of into the second year, I guess. There's a picture of their assignment in Fort Clinch, which is on Amelia Island in Florida. I took these pictures a couple years ago, but you can see it was a nice brick fort, very quiet. Nothing happened there except you were likely to die of malaria. But the 97th did go off to war, as we'll see later. Henry Gus was the proprietor of the Green Tree Inn, which was at the corner of Gay and High Street. The Green Tree Apartments are there today. So he was proprietor from 1854 right up until 1892. His main business, however, was a brickyard. And if a house in Westchester is brick and was built around the Civil War or later, it was probably built in bricks from General Gus's brickyard. There is General Gus's nephew, Buffalo Bill Cody. He visited his uncle in Westchester in 1872, and he liked Westchester so much that Buffalo Bill bought a house here. And there's his house, 125 East Washington Street. He purchased it in 1873 before he traveled to Europe with his famous Wild West show, where he performed before Queen Victoria and any number of petty princes from Germany and those places. They just ate it up. They loved the like the Attack on the Wagon Train, where Sioux Indians, real Sioux Indians, attacked the wagon, and then the cavalry came over the hill, led by Buffalo Bill. But that's his house, still standing at 125 East Washington Street. General Gus died. There's his grave marker in Oakland Cemetery in Westchester. Last time I looked, it was pretty decrepit, but somebody at least cleaned off where his name was. And our last general is probably the most famous here in Chester County, the hero of Fort Fisher, General Uriah Galusha Pennypacker. Great names. He was born in 1842. And there's a little asterisk there because we're going to discuss that. In Valley Forge. When he was 4 years old, his mother died of the smallpox. And his father took off for the Mexican War. And after the Mexican War was over, he went to the gold fields of California, gold rush of 1849, where he did become pretty wealthy. He left Galusha to be brought up by his grandparents in Schuylkill Township. At the outbreak of the Civil War, he was living in Westchester, and he joined Colonel Gus's regiment. He had started out in one of those 90-day regiments that was called for by Lincoln at the beginning of the war, and he was their quartermaster. He was 19 years old. When the 97th was formed, he was friendly with Colonel Gus, and he was made major. So he was jumped from quartermaster, and when the 97th was formed, he became major. So he was in third in command, the 97th Pennsylvania. After the Battle of Cold Harbor in 1864, he became colonel of the 97th Pennsylvania. And later he became brigade commander in the 2nd Division of the 10th Corps, and he fought at New Market Heights. And then his brigade was attached in 1865 to the Fort Fisher expedition. Here's where he was working when the Civil War started. He was 18 years old. He was an apprentice printer for the Chester County Times, which was in the basement of this building, 28 West Market Street in Westchester. Remember, he had been abandoned by his father, and coincidentally, in 1861, his father had a new family out in California, and he too was a printer. And he had recently founded and operated the Petaluma Argus, which is in the Napa Valley. So maybe printer's ink ran in the blood. But Pennypacker had ambitions to be a soldier. And one of the stories is he moved to Westchester at the urging of his uncle that he was named after, Uriah Pennypacker. And Uriah Pennypacker was friends with another man named Uriah Painter, who was a Westchester lad, and he went off to war, and he was a journalist for the Philadelphia Inquirer. So he followed the Army of the Potomac, and somehow he became friends with President Lincoln, or at least acquainted with him. So at some point during the Civil War, Major Pennypacker of the Volunteers wants to become a captain in the regular army. So he persuades his uncle Uriah to write a letter to Uriah Painter and tell him, I'll pay you $100 if you can persuade President Lincoln to name Galusha Pennypacker a captain in the regular army. it was very important to get a commission in the regular army because that was going to set your pension for life. So that sort of bribery is not something that's just happened, in the last 20 years. And here it was back then too. And he never did get that commission from President Lincoln. All right, let's see. Somehow it doesn't want to go. Taylor, can you do the next one? Okay, so we left Pennypacker in the 97th. His brigade was sent down to Fort Fisher. Fort Fisher is at the tip here of the peninsula where the Cape Fear River goes into the Atlantic Ocean. And it protects the port of Wilmington, North Carolina, which was the last Atlantic Ocean port that was open to the Confederacy by the end of the war. The blockade had cut off all the other ports. They had taken Charleston and Savannah. This was the last place where blockade runners could come in, go up the Cape Fear River to Wilmington, and there was a railroad that went from Wilmington port all the way up to Petersburg and was supplying Lee's army. So the Union decides they're going to take this fort and cut off this last port. So the assault on Fort Fisher takes place January 15th. There was a strong naval bombardment. They had put some bomb ships out in the ocean. They blew up. It had no effect on the fort because the walls were basically made of sand. And some sailors tried an assault on the beach side, which failed. So General Ames, who was in charge of the whole operation, he launched a land attack on the fort's ramparts. Here we see Pennypacker's brigade is in the second line, and they're going to come around to the flank where Shepherd's battery is and attack the fort that way, while these other troops attack it from the front. Wait a minute. So there's a depiction from Harper's Weekly of the land assault on Fort Fisher by Ames Division, which included Colonel Pennypacker's brigade. There's a picture of the Shepherd's battery at Fort Fisher, which was the aiming point for the assault. So Pennypacker's brigade in the second line climbed the traverse to the right of the cannon here, and the fort soon surrendered. Now, during that assault, Pennypacker got out in front with about 10 men. He grabbed the flag of the 97th Pennsylvania, charged up the traverse. When they got to the top, a group of Confederates stood up, fired a volley, severely wounded Pennypacker in the groin. And the rest of the men singled out the Confederate who had shot him and beat him to death with their muskets. But the wound was so severe that his uncle Uriah back in Westchester actually had a coffin made for him because they expected him to die. And here's some of the personal effects of General Pennypacker. These are at the Chester County History Center. Included his uniform coat, his Medal of Honor, his sword made in Solingen, Germany. This was all donated. This collection was donated by his family after his death, and it included a saddle which has disappeared from the History Center. They don't know where it got off to. What am I doing? What is going on here? So he was treated at Chesapeake Hospital in Newport News for 10 months after his wounding. And due to his heroics there at Fort Fisher, he was breveted Brigadier General of Volunteers effective on the date of the attack. And he was actually promoted to that rank in February. And then he was breveted Major General in March of 1863. There's been lots of talk over the years that he was the youngest general ever in the American Army. In 1860, when he was first breveted there, he was the youngest at the time, but there had already been one younger before him. But when he was breveted Major General in 1865, he was the youngest ever in history, and he remains the youngest ever in history. Our Chester County. There's his Medal of Honor. You can see it was not awarded him until 1891. During the Civil War, most of the medals of honor went to men who captured flags. So like at Gettysburg, after Pickett's attack, you could go out, pick up flags off the field, bring them back to the headquarters and win a Medal of Honor. The ones for heroism were generally started to be made in the 1880s, 1890s. So his was awarded him in 1891. He was still alive. And it says here, he gallantly led the charge over a traverse and planted the colors of one of his regiments and was severely wounded. The 97th Pennsylvania won 5 medals of honor during the Civil War. There's his cousin, Governor Sam Pennypacker, his first cousin, and he was the 23rd governor of Pennsylvania. As a 20-year-old, he served with the 26th Pennsylvania Volunteer Militia at Gettysburg when General Early's troops approached in June 26th. They fired a volley and they ran like hell. They were not going to stand up to the battle-hardened troops of the Army of Northern Virginia. Like many other heroes of the Civil War, Pennypacker had some political ambitions. We know, for instance, Joshua Chamberlain served as governor of Maine for 4 terms. Well, Pennypacker, when he came back to Westchester, was a hero. They asked him to run for governor, and due to his wounds, he was not able to be in politics. So the family got together and said, well, we want a Pennypacker as governor, so let's pick Samuel. So Samuel got into politics, rose all the way to the top. There's Pennypacker's 5th cousin. He recognized General George Armstrong Custer. Both of them descended from Paulus Custer, who came to Germantown, Pennsylvania from Crefeld, Rhineland, Germany in the late 60s. Full disclosure, on my mother's side, I also descend from Paulus Custer. So Custer and Pennypacker and I are at least DNA cousins. When Custer was promoted to Brigadier General, he's also thought to be one of the youngest ever. He was already 1 year older than Pennypacker. And one of those coincidences in the war, both he and Pennypacker served under General Terry during their careers. So General Pennypacker stayed in the regular army as a colonel until 1883. And he was promoted to Brigadier General once he retired. He was a lifelong bachelor. You saw his picture. He was a pretty handsome guy. He was a hero. But due to the nature of his wounds, it was obvious that he could never fulfill the duties of a married man with a woman, so he never pursued marriage. He was active in the Military Order of the Loyal Legion and the Society of the Cincinnati. And he lived at 300 South 10th Street in Philadelphia for the last 23 years of his life until dying in 1916. That's his house, which is still there. Now, I said earlier we had that asterisk on his age. Pennypacker himself, after the war, started fudging his birth date. And he changed it from 1842 to 1844. And this was sort of, we don't know exactly why it was done, but it was sort of promoting the fact that he was the youngest general ever, and that he was made general before he was old enough to vote. And there was some, criticism of that I read, and I decided I was going to try to dig into it. So I started looking at census reports, and I couldn't find his name in any of the US Census, specifically in 1850. And then I said, well, he was living with his grandparents. Let me put his grandparents' name in. Sure enough, in the 1850 census, I found that he was living with his grandparents in Schuylkill Township. That census was taken in 1850, and he would have been 8 years old if he was born in 1842. The reason he was so hard to find is the census taker omitted his last name. So if you were searching for Pennypacker, you couldn't find him. You had to search for Galusha. But anyway, the census takers in those days came around and they'd see the kid sitting there and they'd ask the grandparents, how old is he? And they'd say, he's about 9. And that's what they put down. You didn't show a birth certificate or anything. But obviously he wasn't born in 1844, or he would have been 5 or 6 years old, and the census taker would have noticed the difference. Then I found his death certificate. He died October 1916 in Jefferson Hospital of a dissecting aneurysm of the abdominal aorta, internal hemorrhage, and a gunshot wound of the right hip, duration 50 years. It took him 50 years to die from that wound. It's never healed. And basically he bled to death in the hospital. And you can see here on the death certificate, it's signed by Miss Pennypacker. We don't know who that is because he wasn't married. It was probably a niece or maybe a sister. But here it says date of birth on his death certificate, June 1, 1842. So that means when he was made general, he was old enough to vote, and we'll see in a minute, he was not the youngest general ever. There's his death tribute in the Philadelphia Inquirer. And you can read it there. He has lived in constant pain, cared for by faithful servants who alone knew of the long years of agony he suffered from his wounds in the war, and death must have come as a relief. The saddest part of his life was that his early prospects of higher fame were destroyed by the wounds of the enemy. There's his grave at Philadelphia National Cemetery. And you notice here the date of his birth is incorrect, 1842. Pennsylvania and his friends recognized his heroism. And a statue was erected almost 20 years after his death. It's at basically at Logan Square, 19th and the Ben Franklin Parkway. And it is the weirdest Civil War monument you'd ever see. He's dressed as a Greek classical warrior, and he's striding forward over a cannon, and he's flanked by two tigers. No idea. The artist, Albert Les. But he lay like a warrior, taking his rest with his martial cloak around him. Now, the first question I always get is, well, who was the youngest general ever? It turns out it was Brigadier General Charles Dodge. He was born in 1841, so he was a year younger than Pennypacker. But he was promoted to Brigadier General November 29th, 1862, 21 years old and 74 days. And he was with the 1st New York Mounted Rifle Regiment. He resigned in June of 1863, so that was right before Custer became the youngest at the time. Charles Dodge became extremely rich. His father co-founded the mining giant, which still exists, Phelps Dodge. Now we saw a statue. He was such a hero, they actually composed a march for General Pennypacker in 1869. And I found this buried at the Musical Archives of the University of Pennsylvania. And probably hadn't been looked at in 130 years or something. I bought the music, and I had Wayne Zimmerman, one of the organists at Westminster Presbyterian, play it on one of the organs at the church. So if I can work this properly, we will play for you this march, which probably hadn't been heard in 140 years. So No, maybe someday we can get a full band to play that. March down Market or High Street. That's my presentation on our 10 generals from Chester County. Any questions or anything? No, it's named after, I think it's just a Pennypacker family. It's Pennypacker Creek and there was, a small number of families in Germantown, the Custers, the Hendricks, the Pennypackers, they all intermarried, and there's thousands of descendants now. Gail.
Here in the regular army, did they fight in battles or?
Yeah, they were all mixed in together. At the time of the Civil War, there were only about 17,000 members of the regular army. And they did expand it during the war, but the vast majority of soldiers were in the US volunteers. These were regiments formed by the state. Lincoln gave quotas to each state to how many regiments they had to raise based on population. So you were just a volunteer if you signed up for those regiments. And they were all disbanded until I guess the Spanish-American War, they had volunteer units again. Anything else? Okay, well, thanks very much. Yes.